I used to think the biggest surprise I'd ever get in life would be finding out my old pickup finally passed inspection without costing me another paycheck. Turns out I was wrong, because about 6 months after my grandmother passed away, I got a call that completely flipped my life upside down. At first, I almost ignored it. Just another number I didn't recognize. Probably someone trying to sell me insurance or refinance debt. I barely had enough money to keep paying anyway. But when I answered, the man introduced himself as an estate attorney and asked if I could stop by his office regarding my grandmother's property. Property. That word alone caught me off guard because my grandmother, Eleanor Brookswell, that's not her real name anymore. Because some names deserve privacy, never acted like someone who owned anything. She spent most of her life cleaning other people's houses, then stocking grocery shelves after dinner just to keep the lights on. She lived in a tiny assisted living room during her last few years, sharing it with another elderly woman. And I helped cover part of the monthly bill because Social Security barely stretched far enough. If you'd asked anyone who knew her, they'd have told you she was one of the poorest people in town. She never complained, never asked for favors, never talked about investments or land or wealth. She always smiled, always made coffee too strong, always slipped $20 into my pocket on my birthday, even though I knew she couldn't afford it. So when I sat across from that attorney, I expected a box of old photographs, maybe a rusty watch, maybe enough money to cover funeral flowers. Instead, he slid a thick folder across the desk, unfolded a county survey map, tapped the center of it with his pen, and said, "Congratulations, you've inherited approximately 1,300 acres. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. Then he didn't laugh back. He rotated the map toward me, pointed again, and suddenly I realized he wasn't joking at all. My grandmother had quietly owned over 1,300 acres of land for decades, and right in the middle of that property sat something that made even less sense than the inheritance itself, an entire luxury homeowners association. 78 custom-built homes with manicured lawns, a private clubhouse, tennis courts, walking trails, decorative ponds, and a swimming pool that looked like something you'd see at a high-end resort. Every single one of them sitting on land that legally belonged to my grandmother and now belonged to me. I stared at the paperwork, trying to figure out whether someone had made a mistake, because rich neighborhoods aren't usually built on property owned by an elderly woman who spent her afternoons clipping grocery coupons. That's when the attorney explained everything. 40 years earlier, before the area exploded in value, a developer had approached my grandmother's father with a long-term ground lease. Instead of selling the land outright, the family leased it, believing it would provide steady income for generations. After everyone else passed away, the property quietly transferred to my grandmother. She honored the agreement every single year without making waves, never raising her voice, never demanding more money, never reminding anyone who actually owned the ground beneath their million-dollar homes. Then the attorney showed me the lease payment, $2,000 a month. I actually thought I had misread the number, so I looked again. $2,000 every month for 1,300 acres of prime real estate that was now surrounded by booming development. Even I knew that was ridiculous, and I don't pretend to be some real estate expert. Before I could ask another question, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. But apparently news travels fast in expensive neighborhoods because the man on the other end introduced himself as the president of the Homeowners Association. We'll call him Martin Caldwell. His voice carried that polished confidence you hear from people who spent years believing everyone eventually says yes to them. He didn't offer condolences for my grandmother, didn't ask how I was doing, didn't even pretend to be friendly for more than 10 seconds. Instead, he said, "We assume you'll continue honoring your grandmother's arrangement. Stability is important to our community." Community? Funny word considering not one person from that neighborhood had ever visited my grandmother while she was alive. Not one birthday card, not one Christmas basket, not one check-in after she broke her hip. They had benefited from her kindness for decades without ever wondering who made that kindness possible. Something about his tone rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation. Like I had inherited an obligation instead of a choice. I thanked him politely, told him I intended to review every page of the agreement before making any decisions. And that's when his voice cooled several degrees. "There's really nothing to review," he said. "Your grandmother understood what good neighbors do." I hung up, drove straight to an attorney who specialized in property law, and together we started reading every page, every amendment, every handwritten note attached to that 40-year-old lease. Hours passed before he suddenly leaned back in his chair, smiled, tapped one paragraph with his finger, and said, "Well, this changes everything." Buried inside the agreement was a clause that almost nobody had paid attention to because it had never been triggered. If ownership transferred through inheritance, the new landowner had the immediate right to reassess and adjust rental terms based on current circumstances. I looked at that sentence, then thought about my grandmother working double shifts while wealthy families hosted pool parties on land she practically gave away. I remembered eating instant ramen through college because I couldn't afford anything else while she secretly owned one of the most valuable properties in the county, but never charged enough to comfortably pay her own medical bills. I wasn't interested in revenge, but I also wasn't interested in pretending that generosity meant accepting exploitation forever. Fair market value was estimated at nearly $20,000 a month, but I didn't even ask for that. I drafted a formal notice increasing the lease to $6,000 per month. Exactly triple the previous amount, but still dramatically below market value. I signed the letter, mailed it, and figured reasonable people would understand that paying a fraction of fair value for 40 years had been an incredible bargain. I had no idea that by the end of that week, I'd become the most hated man in the entire neighborhood. And what happened next would prove just how dangerous entitlement can become when someone finally says one simple word: no. Now, let me hit pause for a second because this is where a lot of people immediately jump to the wrong conclusion. They hear rent tripled and assume the new owner must be the greedy one. But according to standard procedure, long-term ground leases often include review clauses that activate after major ownership changes, especially through inheritance. Those clauses exist because markets change, property values change, and sometimes agreements that were perfectly reasonable 40 years ago become wildly unbalanced. From a legal perspective, owning the land doesn't automatically mean you can throw people out overnight, but it absolutely can give you rights that the previous owners simply chose not to exercise. And here's something even more interesting. This is a psychological trap. When people receive an extraordinary benefit for decades, they slowly stop seeing it as generosity and start believing they're entitled to it. That's human nature, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. The lesson here is that kindness only remains kindness when it's appreciated. Once people begin treating it like an obligation, conflict becomes almost inevitable. What happened after those notices went out proved that point better than anything I could have imagined. By the next morning, my phone looked like it had lost its mind. Missed calls, voicemails, emails coming in faster than I could read them. And somehow people I'd never met had already decided exactly what kind of person I was. According to them, I was greedy, selfish, disrespecting my grandmother's legacy, destroying a neighborhood that had always been like family. Funny thing about that phrase, family usually knows where you live. Family usually visits when you're sick. Family usually doesn't wait until money is involved before they remember your name. Martin called 5 times before lunch, and on the 6th attempt, I finally answered. He didn't bother with small talk this time. "Do you understand what you've done?" he demanded. "You've put unnecessary financial pressure on dozens of families." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the lease sitting on my desk. "Martin," I said calmly, "I raised the lease by $4,000 a month. Divided across 78 homes, that's barely over $50 per household every month." There was a long pause. He hadn't expected math. Then he changed tactics. "That's not the point." "Actually," I replied, "I think that's exactly the point." He hung up before I could say another word. Over the next several days, the HOA's Facebook group turned into a full-time drama channel. People who had never spoken to me were suddenly experts on my character. Some claimed I was trying to force retirees out of their homes. Others insisted I planned to sell the land to developers and bulldoze the entire community. One woman somehow concluded I hated neighborhoods in general. Rumors spread faster than facts ever do. And I quickly realized something. Very few people had actually read the notice I'd sent. They were reacting to Martin's version of the story, not mine. Then came the official invitation to attend an emergency HOA meeting. Invitation wasn't really the right word. It felt more like a summons. My attorney smiled when I showed it to him. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," I answered, "but I think I should." The meeting took place the following Thursday evening. I drove straight there after work wearing dusty boots, faded jeans, and the same work shirt I'd spent all day in. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I simply wasn't interested in dressing up for people who'd already decided I was the villain before hearing a single sentence from me. The clubhouse looked exactly like you'd expect. Polished hardwood floors, expensive lighting, framed photos celebrating neighborhood events stretching back decades. Nearly every chair was occupied. 70 or so faces turned toward me at once. You could practically feel the temperature drop. Martin stood near the front beside a projector screen displaying charts about rising community expenses almost as if he were giving a corporate presentation instead of discussing land that someone else's grandmother had quietly subsidized for 40 years. "Thank you for finally joining us," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Everyone here has been deeply concerned by your recent decision." Concerned, another interesting choice of words. One by one residents stood up to speak. A retired banker claimed I was exploiting elderly homeowners. A business owner accused me of attacking community values. Someone in the back muttered that my grandmother would have been ashamed. That one caught my attention. Ashamed. I let everyone finish. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody stopped them. They deserved the opportunity to say what they believed. Then Martin folded his arms and looked directly at me. "Would you like to explain why you're choosing profit over people?" The room fell silent. I stood slowly, took a breath, and looked around that beautiful clubhouse. "Before I answer," I said, "I'd like to ask a few questions." Nobody objected. "How many of you knew my grandmother's first name?" Silence. "How many of you ever visited her after she moved into assisted living?" Silence again. I kept going. "How many of you sent flowers when she had surgery? Or a Christmas card? Or even called once to ask how she was doing?" You could hear the air conditioner humming. People started looking down at the floor instead of at me. "She cleaned houses for 23 years, I continued. "She stocked grocery shelves at night until arthritis made it impossible. She lived in a shared room because she couldn't comfortably afford private care. Meanwhile, every one of you enjoyed the benefit of a lease so far below market value that most people would never believe it if I told them the number." Martin finally interrupted. "She agreed to those terms." "Yes," I answered. "She did, and she honored them for 4 decades. She never complained. She never demanded more. She gave all of you an extraordinary gift." I paused, letting that settle. The question isn't whether she was generous. The question is, what did any of you ever give back? Nobody answered because there wasn't much to say. I reached into my folder and placed a property valuation on the table. "Independent appraisal," I said. "Current fair market ground lease. Approximately $20,000 per month." Heads turned immediately. Several people leaned forward to read the figures themselves. "I'm asking for $6,000. I looked around the room again. "That's less than 1/3 of market value. You're still receiving an incredible deal." A man near the second row quietly pulled out his calculator. Another whispered something to his wife. You could almost watch reality replacing emotion one person at a time. Martin wasn't ready to let the moment slip away. "This isn't just about money," he insisted. "It's about preserving trust." I nodded. "I agree. Trust matters. My grandmother trusted that the people benefiting from her kindness would remember she existed." That landed harder than anything else I'd said all evening. For the first time since I'd walked into the building, nobody had an immediate comeback. The meeting ended without applause, without shouting, without dramatic threats. Just quiet conversations among neighbors suddenly forced to look at the situation from an angle they had spent years ignoring. Over the next month, 3 families decided to sell their homes. Honestly, I understood their decision. Everyone's financial situation is different, and I never celebrated anyone leaving. But the remaining homeowners signed the updated lease without further legal challenges because every attorney they consulted reached the same conclusion. The adjustment complied with the contract. Some residents even began introducing themselves when I'd drive through the neighborhood. One elderly couple stopped me to apologize, admitting they'd never realized how little my grandmother had been receiving all those years. Another resident quietly handed me an old photograph she'd found from a community picnic decades earlier. In the corner of the picture stood my grandmother, smiling beside folding tables she'd helped set up, almost invisible compared to everyone else. I kept that picture, not because it proved anything in court, because it reminded me exactly who she was. The first lease payment under the new agreement arrived a few weeks later. I deposited the check, paid off the last of my student loans, set aside money for taxes, and then did something I'd been thinking about ever since leaving that clubhouse. I met with a local community foundation and established a scholarship in my grandmother's memory for students from working-class families who needed help paying for college. Every year, another young person would receive an opportunity that my grandmother never had. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same land that had quietly supported luxury homes for decades would now help ordinary kids build better futures. Martin never called again. We nodded politely whenever our paths crossed. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe he finally understood my decision. Maybe he never did. Either way, the lease remained in place. The neighborhood continued to thrive. And every month, a small piece of my grandmother's sacrifice was finally being honored instead of quietly forgotten. Looking back now, people still ask me whether I ever regretted sending that notice, whether I wish I'd just left everything alone and kept the peace. My answer surprises some of them because it isn't filled with anger or victory. Honestly, I don't wake up thinking about Martin, the HOA board, or even that meeting anymore. I think about my grandmother. I think about those mornings when she'd leave the house before sunrise with a thermos of coffee in one hand and worn-out work gloves in the other, never complaining, never asking why life seemed easier for everyone else. She believed that if you worked hard and treated people fairly, eventually that kindness would come back around. The sad part is, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes good people spend their entire lives giving while other people quietly get used to receiving. And after enough years, they stop recognizing generosity for what it really is. They start calling it normal. They start believing they're entitled to it. That's probably the biggest lesson this whole experience taught me. Gratitude has an expiration date if nobody chooses to practice it. The moment people begin assuming they'll always receive the same favor tomorrow, they stop appreciating the sacrifice that made it possible in the first place. I don't think most of those homeowners were evil people. I honestly don't. I think many of them simply bought houses, signed paperwork, moved into a beautiful neighborhood, and never once stopped to ask themselves who owned the ground beneath their driveways or why their lease costs were unbelievably low compared to everywhere else. They inherited comfort without inheriting the story behind it, and somewhere along the way, convenience replaced curiosity. That's something we all have to watch out for, because it doesn't only happen with neighborhoods or HOA agreements. It happens in families. It happens at work. It happens in friendships. We get so comfortable with someone else's kindness that we accidentally start treating it like a permanent utility bill instead of a gift. Then when that gift changes, we convince ourselves we've been wronged instead of asking whether we appreciated it while we had it. I also learned something about standing your ground. Standing up for yourself doesn't automatically make you cruel. There's this strange idea floating around that if someone has been undercharging you, overhelping you, or sacrificing for you over and over again, they're somehow obligated to keep doing it forever. Life doesn't work that way. Fairness isn't measured by how long an unfair arrangement has existed. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is acknowledge reality and move forward honestly instead of pretending yesterday's circumstances still exist today. My grandmother deserved dignity during her lifetime, not just compliments after she was gone. If raising that lease helped restore even a small piece of the values she gave away for 40 years, then I can live with people misunderstanding my decision. Every scholarship check I sign reminds me why I did it. Somewhere a student is sitting in a classroom because an old woman spent decades quietly protecting land she never bragged about. Somewhere a family worries a little less about tuition because one person's sacrifice finally came full circle. To me, that's a much better legacy than pretending everything was fine just to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Life has a funny way of revealing character when money enters the picture. Some people become louder, some become kinder, some become surprisingly honest. I saw every version of that over the past year, including parts of myself I didn't know were there. Patience matters, facts matter, keeping your temper matters, but respecting the people who came before you, that matters most of all. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had inherited that land, would you have left the lease exactly the way it was, raised it to match the market, or done exactly what I did and settled somewhere in the middle? Was I protecting my grandmother's legacy, or did I go too far? There are good arguments on both sides, and that's exactly why stories like this spark so much debate. Drop your thoughts down in the comments because I read far more of them than you probably realize, and I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between generosity and entitlement. If this story made you think a little differently about property rights, gratitude, or the complicated relationship between kindness and fairness, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-world stories that blend human nature with everyday legal lessons. And until next time, take care of the people who quietly make your life easier, because one day you may discover just how much they were carrying without ever asking for recognition.